Thank you all very much for coming. We have a great panel here today that doesn't need much of an introduction. I'm not going to supply much of one, I'm afraid. Immediately to my right, Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State. Salam Fayyad, the Prime Minister of the governing Palestinian National Authority. Senator Dianne Feinstein. And Bill Mayer, who's the Vice Chair of Aspen's Middle East Investment Initiative. Happy 4th of July, by the way. And I think it's kind of fitting that we're having this conversation on the 4th of July, because what we're talking about, I hope we're going to have a discussion of, is what it takes to create the values and the institutions to foster a stable, functioning Palestinian state. And Mr. Prime Minister, I'd like to start with you and with a kind of philosophical question about governance in advance of statehood. You said to me several years ago, we were leaving Gaza one day together, and there'd just been an Israeli raid into the Gaza Strip, and 5 Palestinians had been killed, and we were passing the departing troops on our own way out, passing a tank, and you said, you turned to me and you said, poor governance is hardly an excuse for colonialism. And another time you said to me, I always preach the need to look in the mirror, responsibility, accountability, all of that, but you should not mistake the depth of my feeling about how unfair it is to put conditions on our freedom. And what I want to ask you about is how
did I say all of that?
You said all of that. With the paradox of what you're trying to accomplish, because you're essentially trying to build democracy without freedom, and you're trying to build the institutions of a state without sovereignty. And I don't think it's well understood why, to a lot of Palestinians, there's a strong argument for not doing either of those things, for either giving up or for taking up arms. Why do you think it makes sense to take this approach?
I really indeed thought so when I first joined the PA. Indeed, in the run-up to that, I had this idea that unless we Palestinians started to work and do the best we can to put us on a path that would lead us to freedom and statehood, we were not going to be in a position to actually see to it that we get to where we're going, ultimately freedom for our people and the right to enjoy it in a state of our own. Of course, I was all too aware of the debate surrounding all of this and the fact that building towards statehood, building capacity, building institutions of state is not an easy thing to do under the best of conditions. Doing it under conditions of occupation with all that comes with that by way of restrictions and the rest of it, and that is very well known, makes it all the harder, but in my view, never impossible. And that really essentially is what underlay those comments that I made to you then when we first met. I think that fundamental approach still valid to getting us to where we're going. And it is, I think, rather fortuitous that we're meeting today on 4th of July, because that's, what the spirit of all of this is about. It's about freedom for our people. It's about getting us to the point of enjoying that which is an absolute right for all peoples around the world, to live as free people with dignity in a country of our own, totally respectful of the needs and sensitivities of all of our neighbors in the region, including Israel. That's an occupation that has to end. To end it, there are requirements. And so far as we are concerned, Palestinians, we need to actually build the institutions, effective institutions of the state. Again, not easy to do under occupation. We need help with that by the international community, led by the United States. And ironically, we need to be enabled to get to where we're going by Israel. Without being enabled by Israel to get to where we're going, it's not going to be possible. So without the assistance of the international community and without being enabled by Israel to actually do those things, build effective institutions of the state, we're not going to be able to do it. But all of that begins, in my view, with us being willing and determined to do our bit. So that really is what governed my thinking on this all along. Of course, for that to make sense, Israel itself had to begin to do certain things, in addition to making it possible for us to move in the direction of building towards statehood. There are also conditions and requirements that Israel had to fulfill, and most, if not all of those elements, whether on our side or on the Israeli side, are captured in an important document called Roadmap to Peace. In essence, there are expectations. First of all, the key deliverable of that process is defined as ending the occupation that began in 1967 and building a Palestinian state to live side by side in peace and security with the state of Israel. That's the key deliverable of the process. When you take that...
Can I pause you there,
yes.
though, and then come back to
yes.
the specific reciprocal steps that are to be taken
yes.
on both sides? Because I was hoping to draw the Secretary in on this, on the kind of philosophical question first, which is, to pose the very basic question. Why is this actually the right approach? Because we've seen in the last 10 years, and many Palestinians, certainly in Gaza, see it this way, that settlements were uprooted in Gaza, but the Palestinians see that as having been as the consequence of force, that it was a function of the Intifada. The Israelis retreated, in the view of many Palestinians, under fire, without a negotiated agreement of any sort, without any obligations placed on the Palestinians. And it certainly wasn't because there were effective institutions created in Gaza before the Israelis left, as we've seen in the chaos since then. So why do you think this approach, if you do, why do you think this is the right way to go?
Well, I do believe that it is very important to establish the governance procedures, because freedom without a set of institutions is very evanescent. I think we've seen that. I think the question is, where does the process begin? And there's incredible difficulty in this. I have to put a little bit of context into this. When I first became secretary and I went to the Middle East, I did, in fact, obviously had many meetings in Jerusalem and spent a lot of time talking to Israelis. And then I went to Ramallah. And I described this as the worst single meeting I ever had, which was in a high school in Ramallah. And the students there asked me what their future was, and I couldn't answer the question. And so it really led me to spend a lot of time looking at where the Palestinian situation was, what the various opportunities were, and what were the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. I actually spent quite a lot of time on it. And the issue was how, in fact, to create some kind of institutional basis so that the Palestinians could, in fact, begin to govern themselves. And so democracy is not an event, and we can talk about the elections, and I'd like to talk about those at some point. But it is a process that requires the building of a set of institutions, whether they are some kind of a legislative branch, some kind of rule of law, and taking away arbitrary action. And where I think we're running into problems, not just in this part of the world, but there is a lack of trust now in any institutional structures, because the institutions are not delivering. And so what I think, and when the Prime Minister speaks about the need for support of what they're doing, it requires creating an atmosphere that allows people to think they are getting something out of democracy. Democracy has to deliver. People want to vote and eat. And so the bottom line is that linkage has to be made, and governance has to provide the streams of being able to deliver so that the freedom has legs, so to speak. I mean, I think it really, and so the governance part, they're just kind of big political science words, but the bottom line is it is the way that the people and their rulers speak to each other.
Senator, can you weigh in on this? What is your view about how effective the institutions are now within the areas under Palestinian control? And what sort of support do you think the international community should be providing that it's not already giving?
Well, thank you. I'd be happy to. And I just want to thank Madeleine Albright for all her work for peace in this area. I've followed it from afar. I've seen the struggle, and you've done a wonderful job, and I think everybody ought to know that, Madeleine. I was privileged to meet Salam Fayyad when he was finance minister in Ramallah, and have watched him from afar, and watched him struggle with the third way, watched him succeed at Jenin, watched him advocate for a peace settlement. And I truly believe that he is a man of integrity and a man that deserves great respect. Now, what do I think with respect to the institutions? Israel wants to survive as a Jewish democratic state. Israel wants security. Palestinian people want a state of their own, and they need the institutions, the civil institutions, to build that state. Israel can help build that state, provided she receives the security that she needs and the right to exist. It seems to me that basically this is a pretty good trade-off. I've been in the United States Senate for 16 years. I chair now the Intelligence Committee. I see the intelligence. A lot of it cannot be discussed. But I can tell you this, militarily, there is no solution. The only solution is peace and settlement. I also very deeply believe that we know what the parameters of peace are. They rest in Taba, with exception of perhaps the proportionality part of it. But you've got to overcome what are generations of hatred. And it has to be done relatively fast. I view this time as a real window of opportunity. I thought after the death of Yasser Arafat, we had that window open again, and Gaza came into the picture. We now have a new American administration. They have put the issue on the front burner. We have a new Secretary of State also committed to the issue, as was Madeleine, but early in the term. And I know George Mitchell. He was the majority leader when I came to the Senate. And as you all know, he was very skilled in the handling of the Northern Ireland situation. He's spending a great deal of time. It is my belief that in the next couple of years is the time for the peace settlement, which can give the Palestinian people the freedom they want, can help Israel remain a democratic state, a Jewish democratic state, and that's tough because the demographics are against it. And as I've watched, I see more people in the region wanting peace. As I participated somewhat in the Aspen effort bill, we had a meeting in Washington, Madeleine, I think you were there, with Palestinian businessmen, Israeli businessmen, sitting in a room talking about projects that they could do together to improve the economy. In this case, it was in Gaza and some of it in the West Bank. And I thought at that time, for me, it was a seminal moment because it told me it can happen. If people care enough, it can happen. And so I believe very strongly that the United States has to lay very strong hands on a peace settlement, has to move both sides. I believe the moderate Arab nations, Egypt is now playing a role trying to negotiate between Hamas and Fatah. I don't know how that will turn out, but at least it's an effort. And I think generating both Egypt and Jordan, and even to some extent Lebanon, to be the focus to push for agreement. I think the parameters of an agreement are known. The unknown is the political will on both sides. And with that agreement can come the freedom that the Prime Minister spoke about, and also can come the security for the State of Israel, which we all so yearn for.
I'd like to come back. I'd like to come back to several issues you raised, including the current administration's policy towards resolving the conflict. But Bill, I'd like to draw you in a little bit on the question of what conditions are like on the ground, because you've actually been doing some of the work of trying to jumpstart or strengthen the Palestinian economy and build a stronger infrastructure of small businesses and a stronger middle class. What is it like trying to operate there these days? How easy or hard has it been to try to get things moving?
I don't know if the right word is hard, but everything takes a long time. We've been working on this, the basis of our program, something called a loan guarantee program, to try to free up credit for what I call medium-sized businesses. That project started 5 years ago. And it was disrupted, of course, after the January election when Hamas won. And subsequently, we finally started 20 months ago. And it's gone fine. We're working with 7 banks in the region, and we have a local partner. It just takes time. It's not that anybody is trying to obstruct. It just has been an enormous amount of energy. And you would say in a different venue, this would have all happened a lot sooner. I suppose you could make a case that what I just said is it's therefore hard. But it's not hard because of the people in the Palestinian areas. I mean, they're very entrepreneurial, they're very cooperative, they're very open to some of the, I guess I used the word training with the banks in terms of processing the kind of credit facility we have. And so we at this point have made $28 million of loans. Now to this audience in this country doesn't sound like a lot of money. 80% of those loans have been in the size of $50,000 to $200,000. For an example, an entrepreneur in Jerusalem wanted to replace a fleet of taxis. And that's the kind of loan we're talking about. Somebody opening a restaurant. You know, what I call real businesses by real people on the ground. And the general theory, of course, is if you have some economic activity, you'll create jobs. And I know the Prime Minister is aware that we think the calculation is roughly we've created about 3,000 jobs in the last 20 months through this effort. Is that going to make a difference? Hard to tell. Is it going to hurt? Of course not. So to some degree it's going to help, and you have to start somewhere. But one of the basic problems is, you know, in a study that a professor that worked for me when I was a dean of a business school found that there are 5 things you need in place to have economic growth. And if you don't have them, it won't happen. He did it by looking at why certain countries grew and others didn't. Not surprisingly, of course, at the top is the rule of law, sanctity of a contract, which is what we all like to call a level playing field. And without that, none of this is going to be very, very successful. And secondly is the allocation of economic resources. And in this case, that's pretty good. These resources are being allocated on the ground by demand and by analyzing the creditworthiness of the project. And the third is an educated population. Not a problem. These are well-educated people, extremely entrepreneurial. Fourth is credit. And that was a real bottleneck here. And that's part of the role we're playing with part of our U.S. government, OPIC, the Aspen Institute, obviously, and the Palestinian Investment Fund, which is our local, what I call, equity partner on the ground. And the fifth is also a problem, and that's the ability to move goods. Because you can't have a vibrant economy unless you can move goods.
Madam Secretary, you want to
Well, I think that what Aspen is doing and what Bill described so fits into what needs to happen for issues of developing a future that allows there to be a functioning Palestinian state and jobs. I mean, part of the issue here, Dianne, you were talking about demography. The Palestinian population is a very young population, and a lot of unemployed young people certainly does not work in terms of how to develop a sustained state. And so what I'm very proud of in terms of what Aspen is doing is kind of fitting into a variety of programs here. Certainly MEII is the very basic aspect of creating businesses that provide jobs. And then also a series of dialogues that we have been involved in that really brings various peoples together, the business people, and creates an atmosphere that then allows a variety of ways to help the Palestinian Authority. I think that one of the issues here, and in going back on why Hamas won, Hamas delivered constituency services. And I think, I mean, it's just as simple as that. I have a real question as to whether they should have been allowed to participate in an election if they don't, in fact, give up violence as a tool. That should be kind of an entry fee. But one of the issues here is that governments have to deliver. And it is possible for outside help to make that more viable. And I think that that's where the MEII program has done a great job. And then also Aspen has a young leaders program of trying to get new people involved in this. But the issue here is how to make it viable, because I personally believe, as I do, as you do, or we all do, in the security of Israel, and Israel will be more secure if there is a viable Palestinian state. I am convinced of that. Now, the problem is the roadmap. I am all for roadmaps, but you actually have to take them out of the glove compartment. And, the bottom line here is that's what didn't happen in the last years. And so it is something that we all have to work on. Dianne, you're right. I think this administration is really committed to moving the process forward. And I think that's the essential aspect.
Mr. Prime Minister, putting both of those last two comments together, I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about what the Palestinians are doing for themselves, because Bill raised the issue of law enforcement and
Yes.
how hard it is to create any kind of functioning economy without the predictability that comes from a seriously enforced rule of law. And both the Senator and the Secretary talked about the importance of security, obviously, to moving forward at all with any kind of peace process. The last time I spent any real time in Nablus,
Yes.
The conditions there were basically anarchy. Nablus is a beautiful city in the West Bank, seat of the Palestinian Stock Exchange. Really, this is the heart of the Palestinian economy, I think, in the West Bank. And at the time, a lot of the local Fatah militia was functioning more like a mafia, shaking down restaurants, kidnapping people for ransom. And there was effectively no police whatsoever on the streets. I understand conditions have changed there, and I'd like to hear you talk about why you focused on Nablus and what you've tried to get done.
First of all, I'm very happy to tell you that's not happening anymore. Nablus belongs back to people of Nablus, and they feel it. And over the past 2 years, we were able actually to do things in the area of law and order that resulted in an entirely different reality, something which people yearned for a very long time, projecting it as a basic Palestinian need, that is security and law and order, in addition to it being something with important regional ramifications insofar as our relationship with Israel and the rest of the region is concerned. But clearly, you cannot have economic development under conditions of anarchy. And I believe it's that lawlessness, state of lawlessness, is what did us in Gaza. And my own sense is that the West Bank, unfortunately, was not that far behind at the peak of the state of lawlessness and chaos that prevailed in the occupied Palestinian territory of the period 2001 onward. So no, there has been a major turnaround, and I think people feel that for sure. That's something that's also recognized by all observers, including in Israel, both at the security level and the political level. It's all very important element of getting us from A to B. Security, after all, is the most important service which any responsible state is to provide to its citizens, first and foremost. That had to be the starting point, given this diagnosis. Clearly, key prerequisite to economic development. By itself, one of 5 conditions mentioned, you heard, today as having to obtain in order for there to be sustainable economic development by itself is not enough, but it's certainly a good point to start with. And without it, you really cannot have much of anything. People understand that. Nablus actually witnessed a lot of positive activity over the period since we deployed our security services in Nablus after a period of being unable to do so, including a business conference where people from the region, including Jordan and other countries, came to participate, to look for things to do. Life generally improved. Happy to tell you that actually 2 or 3 weeks ago, Nablus witnessed the opening, this you may perceive or see as a mundane event, not to us Palestinians, a reopening of a movie theater in Nablus after so many years. That tells you something about the state of mind and how things have shifted. All of this is important, and as I say, it's a prerequisite, but the other element that was mentioned as a prerequisite to getting things moving is access. Being able to move people and goods in order for you to have economic development. I can tell you for sure, creating 3,000 jobs is something that is extremely helpful. We need a lot more of that. To build on that, to put things in perspective, we have some 45,000 young men and women who enter the labor force every year. And we already have a very high rate of unemployment, including in the West Bank, not only in Gaza. But an initiative like the one you had briefly described in terms of microcredit and loan guarantee scheme is an important element. Credit is not an issue in Palestine. Uncertainty is. In Palestine, credit to deposit ratio is the lowest in the world. It's less than 30%. I mean, it's not lack of availability of resources or credit that's really inhibiting economic development. It's that uncertainty, lack of ability to move people and goods are at the heart of being unable to get the economy to move in a sustainable way. So we need to get all of those elements together. But you're absolutely right. Security is key, is key element of really projecting the authority that the authority should project, because it is the nucleus of the state. This is really what defines what this is all about. And at the core of the institution building effort that has to really be mounted and pursued until it matures.
Senator, the roadmap called for the Palestinians to take very aggressive measures on security at the very outset as part of the first stage. Do you regard these efforts as sufficient under the terms of the roadmap? And then secondly, the administration is putting what seems like a tremendous amount of pressure on this Israeli government on the matter of settlement expansion. Do you think that's the right approach? Why would that be at all helpful in moving us forward?
Well, let me answer the last part first. I do support President Obama saying that there should be an end to settlements.
Expansion.
I think the expansion of settlements, and if I believe this is correct, between 2007 and 2008, they doubled the number of units. And this is like a boil on the skin of the Palestinian. And it has to be understood. You can't keep occupying the land if there's going to be a state that comes out of it, that's going to be a Palestinian state. I know this is a very hard issue for Israel, but that bullet has to be bitten, and you have to stop those settlements. I think if they would, and I know that Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that he would look at a 3 to 6 months freeze. I'd hope that Prime Minister would comment on that. I think if we could begin, even if you begin small and then continue it. I've seen some of the settlements. I know how Palestinians feel about it. And one thing is, you have to have some respect for your neighbor. On the issue of security, security relates directly to rockets, to terror, to IEDs, and that relates to everything you're trying to do. Because if that stops, and then it builds a sense of security, and people will invest. And Bill, one thing in the time I was active with Madeleine and you and others on this effort, what I saw is Americans will invest. You can find investment to go in there. And, but if they're worried about being destroyed the next day, they're not going to do it. So I think really being able to secure the landscape is the most important thing. Are law enforcement efforts adequate? Candidly, no, they aren't. And that, I think, is a problem that has to be settled. Now, we have tried to help with that in terms of money, and a lot of money for the Presidential Guard, and training. But this is something I believe the Palestinians have to do for themselves, and the government, the Palestinian Authority, has to be able to do that. You have to be able to provide security for your people. Let me make one other point. I really believe in micro-lending. I really believe that if you can get a woman that has 12 chickens and give her the loan to enable her to have 150 chickens, and she can then sell eggs and make a business for herself and grow, that's important. I really think it's important to do some of this lending, a lot of it, to women, that women become entrepreneurial even more than they already are, all throughout the Middle East. Thank you, thank you. And I've seen it work in areas. So the degree to which I think you can really diversify your lending and reach out to small people is really important.
Mr. Prime Minister, do you want to respond to those 2 points about settlements and security, and then we'll build on microfinance?
Yeah, in the context of the roadmap, which I agree with the Secretary, had to first be taken out of the glove compartment. I believe that happened at Annapolis. It just simply was not followed after that until
It was
now.
put
That's the
back.
problem. So where we are, and I agree with the Senator now, is at a point of much better understanding and appreciation of the need to actually follow what the roadmap says. There are obligations on both sides. I've always argued for much higher standard of accountability than had been followed since the peace process was launched. Accountability symmetrically demanded of both parties to this conflict. For us, it meant that we do everything we possibly can to enhance our capacity to govern ourselves in all spheres of governance, including especially security. On the Israeli side, and we talked about that, and so far as the security component of this is concerned, we've been able to actually achieve a major turnaround over the past couple of years, for sure, in ways that not many expected, to tell you the truth, considering the absolute state of lawlessness that had prevailed for several years. The turnaround that we were able to achieve in the way people, security services, felt about their mission, what it was about, what sort of security doctrine, what this enterprise was all about, was absolutely major by any standard. Of course, this is all being helped now with an effort in parallel to build for the future with new recruits and all. But we managed to do, I think, a fairly good job with what we had over the past couple of years by, number one, having our security services redeploy in all areas they had deployed in up until spring of 2002.
With Israeli agreement.
With Israeli agreement. And now what we really are looking for, and this goes to the heart of what this is about and goes back to the question which you asked first, the role of governance. If this is about statehood, clearly we Palestinians have to demonstrate first and foremost to ourselves that we indeed can govern ourselves effectively. But through that also to the international community at large, to Israel, that indeed we can govern ourselves effectively. This is what this is about. In security, I think we achieved that. What is really important, and security, as the Senator said, is in the nature of an ongoing concern. You need to keep working on it, because unless you do, you slide back. So we really need to stay with this and continue to improve our capacity. The point that I really would like to make is, just as governance is important to pursue as an agenda, it has to be seen in meaningfully in the context of an effort that will ultimately lead to ending the occupation. If it doesn't, then this whole exercise may risk being seen as an exercise in making the occupation work better rather than ending it. This is politically very important for us. And in the security sphere, what is essential, and I go back to the roadmap and the need to follow it, now that we actually have deployed successfully in all of the urban areas in the West Bank, and effectively achieving a key turnaround in performance in ways that few expected, what is really important is for Israel to take us back to status quo ante, to what prevailed up until spring of 2002, by stopping military raids in areas under our security control. Why is that important? Important in two ways. Number one, politically. It'll be important for us to be able to tell our people, you see, having put ourselves on this path of creating positive facts on the ground, building up our capacity to govern ourselves effectively, believing in and staying with a path of nonviolence to lasting peace, we are able to show a political deliverable represented by a stoppage of Israeli raids into our own cities. It also is important strategically. If this is about statehood, people have to understand, to see that. If this is about statehood, people need to begin to see, our people that is, our areas, controlled in security by our own security, not by the security of the occupation. This happens to be an obligation under the roadmap. One can argue that doing what we have been able to do over the past couple of years in security should have made it possible for Israel now to implement its obligation by stopping the raids in Palestinian areas. And that takes me to settlement activity, another key obligation under the roadmap. Clearly, that has to stop. And in the period after Annapolis, as the Senator said, by any indicator of settlement expansion, you'll find that settlement activity expanded enormously in the year and a half after Annapolis compared to the year and a half before, by any standard, by any indication. And that's what I really mean. taking the roadmap out of the glove compartment, yes, but really actually acting in a manner consistent with those obligations. Only then will this thing begin to make sense both to the Israeli public and the Palestinian public and to the international community led by the United States trying to underwrite this process for us Palestinians to be involved and to be seen as seriously engaged in an effort to build our state, to build the institution of state. And I recently actually put a 2-year time limit on that, you know, in terms of expectation. And for Israel to actually begin to act in a manner consistent with the political and physical viability of this concept of two-state solution. I think when that happens, people on both sides will begin to buy into this process, because after all, this is not about peace between governments. This is about peace between peoples and between business communities, and all for it to be lasting and durable and to be sustainable. So these things are important, and it's important also from the point of view of the United States leading the international community, an international community that has invested in this concept, not only financially and economically, but also politically, and I would say even morally.
Bill, I should give you the opportunity to respond on the microfinance
Sure.
point, and then I'd like to draw the Secretary, and then I'm going to open it up to questions from you all. There are mics on either side of the room, and people might want to wait a minute and then start moving to the microphones if you have a question, or race there if you want to be first. Sure.
I'll get to the question of microfinance in a second, but speaking from my own personal experience, when I first went over and saw, quote, the settlements, I was quite surprised because, of course, I'm an American. I study the American West. I think of a settlement as 20 people and a couple of covered wagons and something like that, 3 cows and 4 horses. So we're driving around outside of Jerusalem with Lana here in the audience, and so what's that? That's a settlement. I said, what do you mean? It's a city. It's not a settlement. And I think that for the people here on the panel and the people that have been there, but for a lot of the people in the audience that have never been there and really have not seen a settlement, the definition of a settlement is quite different from what at least I thought of as an American, and quite a surprise in a negative way, saying, you know, these are cities that are being built. These are not settlements. Secondly, I really went through a conversion over the last 5 years to being a militant, okay? An economic militant, because when we visited, we were treated quite well. And I was talking to somebody. I said, why are they being so nice to us? She said, you don't understand. You have a lot of people come in here and talk and give a lot of speeches, and then they leave, and nothing really happens. And what you're doing at Aspen and through Aspen is one of the very few things that have actually ever gotten launched. Now, for a guy, that's been involved in finance and economic development and businesses all my life, I think of what we do as, well, that's kind of what we do. But in the context in your earlier, in the opening, and saying it wasn't so hard, it just took a long time, and that's where persistence tends to pay off. And so I have very little tolerance at this point for people that are trying to make excuses, because there are a hell of a lot of impediments, but there are a lot of people that are talking but not necessarily doing things. On the last point of microfinance, we all organize our thoughts differently. I'm sort of a visual guy, and I visualize these are at least in 3 different segments. At the top you have large infrastructure projects, whether it's a desalination plant, whatever you would want to talk, a bridge. These are multi-$100-million projects. That is not what we do. That takes an entirely different kind of process control, approval, and financing from major organizations, perhaps the World Bank. Okay? Then we have the middle, which is what I was talking about, which is typically the backbone of any economy, the mid-sized business. And then we have the micro-lending, and I'm involved in another organization called the Acumen Fund, run by Jacqueline Novogratz, and they do something a little closer to that, and there are a lot of other organizations, and it's extremely important. It doesn't happen to be the charter of MEII, at least as we have organized it, but there are organizations, including a German organization, that is making much smaller loans than $10,000, because you're quite right. And I think the statistics are, not only in the Middle East, but in a lot of the world, the women tend to be the ones that are running these small businesses, and quite successfully.
Madam Secretary,
I had to say successfully.
stepping way back from all the conversation so far, There are a lot of people who say that, in light of what the Prime Minister just said about how this is about building a viable state of Palestine and two states side by side, there are a lot of people who've been saying now for a couple of years that it's actually already too late, given the size of the settlements, as Bill describes them, given the way these two populations are kind of interlaced at this point. And the administration is asking the government of Israel to take what is actually a very hard step, and the Israelis present as almost a nonsensical step, because they're saying they've asked for what they say is, you're essentially asking us not to have babies, that these settlements grow organically. That's what natural growth is. Can you articulate a vision for, let's say they do it, let's say they freeze settlement construction. What happens then? Why does this substantially advance this, and how does the process unfold in a way that it actually does result in, ultimately, in two states side by side?
Well, let me say, I think that it's never too late. I really, on the contrary, I think, and I think the Senator said this is a crucial time. The window of opportunity is there, and I think what is going on is a big push. Some, I think, publicly and some behind the scenes, because it is seen as a time where a difference can be made. And if I might, I think we had to add another dimension to this, and that is the dimension of the Arab world. We have not mentioned the fact that there's an Arab initiative that King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia offered that shows that this is not just an issue between the Israelis and Palestinians, but requires a regional approach in order to push the process forward. I do think, I obviously agree with the Obama administration on the settlement freeze. And Bill, I have to tell you, the first time I saw the settlements, I had the same, somebody in a trailer. You go to some of these, and it's like downtown Los Angeles. And I think the bottom or outskirts of Los Angeles. And these are very permanent-looking places. When we were at Camp David, we figured out, and Dianne, you said this, a lot of the parameters are out there. And there are ways of doing this in terms of land swaps and a variety of ways that does not stop Israelis from having babies. I think that is a really, I don't know if this works, red herring, but I think it is a bogus argument. And I don't think that, and I have to tell people this, I think most of us, I think, come with the presumption that Israel has to exist as a state and be recognized in a very difficult neighborhood. And it cannot be done unless the Arab states are involved and unless there is a viable, I believe, Palestinian state that is not like Swiss cheese. It needs to have a contiguous territory. And we went there. We were there. We were there. I do think, if I may say so, Chairman Arafat bears some responsibility for not having accepted a pretty good deal. But the bottom line here is that this is a time, and I don't think we should think that there's undue pressure being put on the Israeli government. There is pressure being put on the Palestinians. And frankly, I think there is pressure being put generally on other Arab players within this to realize that this is a truly crucial moment. But the U.S. government, and it goes also to what we're doing, I think there needs to be support for the Palestinian Authority. And what did not happen in the last 8 years was enough visible support for Mahmoud Abbas and for the Prime Minister in terms of showing, to go back to the initial point, democracy has to deliver. The people have to feel they are getting something out of the authority and recognizing that they're going to have a state out of it. But I think we need to pay some attention to what the Arabs are doing. And I would love to know what the Prime Minister believes in terms of support that he's getting from other parts of the Arab world.
How much money do they owe you at this point, by the way?
Actually, I can tell you that in the course of last year, 2008, we received substantial sums of money from all over the world, including a record amount from the United States delivered directly to our treasury in the amount of $300 million. It's a large sum of money for us to receive from the U.S.
You for one moment.
Yes.
A lot of this is due to the fact that you're straightened out the finances, and the belief is that the corruption that once existed no longer does, and therefore I think that's a very important hallmark. just wanted to add that.
Thank you very much. So that is the United States, substantial sum for Europe. We received about $1.7 billion in budget support in 2008. That was
In a budget of?
Budget of about $3 billion. So it's a very large sum of money by any standard, certainly by historical standards. And we used the money to, number one, pay off arrears overdue of financial obligations that had accumulated over the 16-month period up to July 2007, when, because of many things, including the financial boycott and the rest of it, arrears, including salaries accumulated. We used that also to meet current obligations in all areas, but we used it importantly to fund small community development programs, which we felt was a very important, necessary adjustment to make, given that the large infrastructural projects were, it looked to us, were going to be extremely difficult to implement, given the restrictions and all. We decided to shift to smaller projects implemented in rural areas, average cost of which is about $250,000. That made it possible for us to respond fast to needs identified and prioritized by local communities themselves. And I agree with you entirely, Madam Secretary, in terms of what you said about democracy not being an event, but rather a process. And in fact, we nurtured that in the way we went about project identification in areas that typically were vastly underserved. We implemented some 700 of those projects. That's what we did with the money. All the while, consistent with building toward a state that was economically viable and not perpetually dependent on aid, we, on an ex-ante basis, reduced our external financing requirement for 2009 by 35%. I mean, a major fiscal adjustment by any standard. So we needed less money in 2009 relative to 2008. $200 million of that sum for external assistance is going to come from the United States, but it's much less than what we needed actually in 2008. So we're doing what we have to do, both in terms of building structurally a system of integrity, but also in terms of the policy content, financial policy, the path of financial policy, consistent with viability, reduced reliance on aid and the rest of it. Unfortunately, though, in the course of 2009, and this begins to answer the question, we are getting less than what is programmed, less than that reduced requirement for external assistance that we need. And that's why over the past 7 or 8 months, as a matter of fact, we've been really going through a very difficult period financially. We're carrying over a financial deficit, a cash deficit of about $25 to $30 million month after month after month, resorting to the banking system to make ends meet. And you know how things go when that is the way you manage. I mean, first of all, it's an incredible preoccupation when, given all else you need to worry about strategically, governance overall, building towards statehood, the political track, and then you have to really worry about making ends meet this way, hand-to-mouth kind of existence. It's blinding. I mean, it's, number one, blinding. Two, it definitely has undermined our capacity to meet our obligations in a timely manner. So now, unfortunately, we're beginning to see a reversal of some of the gains that we were able to achieve in the course of 2008. We're beginning actually to accumulate overdue obligations to the private sector, the very private sector. We want to reinvigorate. We want to really actually get to start doing things more and more. So we are really going through a period of difficulty. Arab support, Arab financial support, out of the $1.7 billion that we received in 2008 amounted to about 30% of that total. Now, so far this year, in 2009, of the total amount that we got, which is about $350 million, substantially below the pace that we really need to be consistent with the full financing requirement for 2009. Arab donor assistance is down to 22% of that total. So clearly we need more. I mean, these are the numbers. I'm just giving you the numbers as they are. We definitely need more than what we have been getting in order for us to be able to manage effectively.
Can I ask one quick question? What was the Arab percentage? If it's down, you said to what, 20%?
Now it's about 22% of the total.
And what was it before?
30% in 2008.
Mm-hmm.
But against the commitments they made to you?
It's less than what was committed. If you go back to Paris Donor Conference as a benchmark, December 2007, it's definitely less than 50% of what was committed then.
Okay. And I think, by the way, the World Bank says that PA salaries still account for about a fifth of the
no more
GDP, 22%
Oh,
or so.
yes, in terms
So
of,
just
yeah.
to show how important it is to keep the
Oh,
salaries.
no, absolutely, absolutely.
Let's open it up to the questions from the floor. I realize, I think, not that anybody would be particularly interested. I don't think I introduced myself at the beginning. My name's James Bennet. I'm the editor at The Atlantic. I say that in asking you to please introduce yourselves. In my own experience, this is a subject that strangely kind of lends itself to harangues. I'd ask that instead of statements, we really take questions from the floor. So please, sir, let's begin with you.
Thank you. My name is Huda Faruqi. I'm a U.S. citizen of Palestinian origin, resident of Washington, D.C. and Aspen, Colorado. And I actually have two questions, one to the Prime Minister. And on a recent trip, Mr. Prime Minister, to Nablus, I had the opportunity to visit Al-Najah University. This was about 3 weeks ago. Very impressive institution with a student body of in excess of 15,000. But I was very much depressed to hear the reaction of many of the students who told me that upon graduation, very few would actually be able to gain meaningful employment. So what are you doing about that? And what are the prospects for employment for these vast number of highly qualified students who are graduating? And then with respect to the Secretary and perhaps the Senator, would you please comment on why is there such a lack of reception or comment on the Arab Peace Initiative introduced 7 years ago by King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia? In fact, part of it established complete recognition of Israel and complete normalization of the relationship between Israel and the Arab countries. Thank you.
First, on job creation, there's hardly much that the government can do in a direct way. I mean, as it is, PA employment, official PA employment is high, and out of the necessity of making our books look good and be consistent with what we want in terms of the reduced reliance on foreign aid, there is not really much room for hiring people on the official payroll. I mean, that's a fact. So our role, to answer your question, is definitely in the realm of, number one, doing the best we can to improve conditions for operation of the private sector. That involves, number one, doing the best we can to provide the right regulatory framework. And a good part of the effort is complete in that area, and some more is on the way to really complete that regulatory framework. That's essential. Two, what we have been doing in the fiscal sphere by putting our finances on a path of sustainability. That, by the way, is a very important element in terms of confidence which the private sector needs to feel to invest. Private sector in any country needs to feel that the finances of the government in which it operates are sustainable, are in a sustainable way. So we're doing the best we can. Unfortunately, what is necessary to happen in order for the private sector to begin to realize the full potential it can have has not really happened. It certainly has not happened with the speed that's necessary. And here I'm talking about removing restrictions on movement. Gaza is under state of complete siege, which many recognize as completely counterproductive, to be honest with you. West Bank suffers from hundreds of physical checkpoints and barriers to movement, in addition to functional barriers to movement in the way of permit requirements that are highly unpredictable, hardly the kind of thing that businesses look for in order for them to be encouraged to invest. So some of this is really part of what the government has to do, but good part of it also relates to the context in which we are operating, and mainly in the sphere of having to begin to see meaningful elimination and removal of restrictions on mobility. But let me add one more thing. One other area where we're making an effort, which definitely would take advantage of tremendous potential for complementarity, including between the Palestinian economy and the Israeli economy, is to develop border industrial zones where it is attractive for Israeli and other international investors to come in and invest, and also where the main access issues are dealt with. We're doing the best we can in order to move up that agenda and move it forward, because we think this is really a very good way of trying to capitalize on those potential complementarities, where instead of, as the case used to be in the mid-90s, moving labor to where capital is, in this case, moving capital to where labor is, this is much more stable and much more sustainable way of job creation in Palestine, we believe.
On the Saudi initiative,
Right.
it should be said that on the day that the Saudi initiative was announced, a suicide bomber blew himself up at a Passover Seder, I believe, in Netanya, and it was outside beginning of an incredibly violent period there, and so there wasn't a lot of talk about it. Now that things have calmed down, how come we don't hear more about that proposal?
Well, in response to Huda's question, I think, James, you just gave him the answer. Terror is such a counterproductive tool. Terror brings out everything that's bad in people. It's very hard to fight it, too, militarily, because Western militaries operate very differently than terrorists operate. And I think James hit the nail on the head. It's too bad, because here you had the Saudi king making a proposal. It was a proposal that by any stretch of the imagination had some merit to it, and someone should have taken it and run with it and evolved it. But instead, what happened was a period of violence. And that's why the violence in this thing throws off statehood, throws back Israeli security, and it's got to stop. And I think if there's a substantial period of cessation and the Palestinian Authority is able to move vigorously and counter it, that you then create, I think, the kind of atmosphere in which a final settlement agreement can really take place.
I also do think that one of the major problems, having been involved in these negotiations, is the chicken and egg problem. I mean, you know,
That's a good point,
I mean, it is a real problem as to
Is that
what takes
microfinance
place.
again?
Well, but it's because in reading the Arab Peace Initiative, it has language in it that affirms that certain things will happen when certain things happen. And the question is how you develop a parallelism, which goes to your point, Diane, in terms of the violence. And the reason I raised the Arab Initiative here is because I do think that it has been underestimated. And I think the combination of the dedication of this administration to do something about it, and I must say President Obama's speech in Cairo, the whole combination of all of that puts everything into play, and I believe the Arab Peace Initiative is a great basis for moving stuff forward, but it is, having been in these negotiations, it's really, you know, Alphonse Gaston that goes on here, and it is a real problem. Nothing's agreed until everything's agreed, and all kinds of things that we've been through.
Let's go here. You know, I screwed up on the initial questioner. I'd like to ask you to confine yourself to just one question so we can try to move through more. Please go ahead.
Yes, my name, I don't know if this is on. Yes.
Yes, it is.
My name is Ron Sims. My question is, what steps are being taken specifically to deal with the issue of corruption in light of the fact Mr. Arafat obviously stole billions of dollars allegedly, and those dollars should go to help the government or to help the people? And also, what are you doing to stop the flow of those rockets that fire into Sderot and other parts of Israel?
I think that was two questions, but please you're certainly asking the...
Okay. Well, I do find myself having to address the premise of the question, but let me get to the result first. Actually, it's been now since mid-2002 when we first met, James and I, and what he's referring to at the outset of the session, that we started to put the finances of Palestinian Authority in order. And over the years, we succeeded, and he would tell you that he was himself a witness to at least some of the work that was done during that period, notwithstanding the high degree of complexity of it all and difficulty associated with achieving turnaround in that score. And we did, and in the process, really bringing the system up to a point of being considered well-run and well-managed and a system of integrity by international standards by 2005. The history of this is as follows, though, subsequently. 2006 through mid-2007, after the elections, January 2006, and Hamas take over power completely. West Bank and Gaza was the government for nearly a year. The system pretty much came undone. The structural reforms that were introduced over the period 2002, 2005 came pretty much undone, as the central feature of that reform was the creation of a single account to which all revenues accrued, and including assistance that came from international community, and out of which all expenditures were executed. And thus the elimination of something that we call in the profession, elimination of all forms of extra budgetary operations, meaning that everything had to happen in accordance with the budget. So the system came undone during that period, at least in part because of the financial boycott, the fact that commercial banks could not deal with the PA during that time period and all, and loss of transparency, things that we had started to do in terms of the information dissemination, the rest of it stopped. That was the state of affairs that we inherited in mid-2007, as a matter of fact, when we, as a matter of highest priority, set forth the goal of reconstituting the system, and that we did over a period of 6 months. By the end of 2007, we were able to actually restore the system to what it was before, and in the few months that followed that, we were able actually to take it a few steps beyond that. And as of March 2008, I'm very happy to tell you that we restored the capacity to regularly, on a monthly basis, put out detailed information on all of our revenues and expenditures on a monthly basis with regularity on the 15th of each month. Those in the profession would tell you that it's not so much the willingness to be open with the world, with your own people, with data and the rest of it that matters, as much as the capacity to do it. The mere fact that we're able to make that promise, I did personally. One of the reasons we did that, again talking about creating an environment for democracy and participation and ownership, it's precisely given the bad experience of 2006 to 2007, when I saw the system that we worked so hard on to put together totally undone. Wanting to really buy ownership, went out and said, as of today, the authority commits itself to this schedule of information dissemination on the 15th of each month. I'm happy to tell you, sir, that since then, we did not miss, not once. 15th of each month, you log on to our website and you'll find full accounting of what the authority got by way of revenues and et cetera, and what it spent and how it spent it, in all of which done completely in accordance with the budget. So as a matter of fact, public finance is one of those areas where the institution building effort is mature and close to actually where it needs to be, given this overarching vision that I outlined about a couple of weeks ago when I said the task of putting together well-functioning, competent, corruption-free institutions of government will be in place within a period of 2 years. And it is certainly my hope that within a couple of, no more than a couple of 4th of July holidays, 4th of July 2011, that actually we all looking at Palestine, whether from Aspen or whether from any other place in the United States, or for that matter, any corner of the world, looking toward us in Palestine, I want you not to have, that's the vision, a hard time thinking to yourself, the Palestinians do indeed have a state. It looks like they have one. The only problem is the occupation, if it has not ended by then. This is really the approach we're taking. Public finance is an area where we really have come a long way, and we are going to work very hard on the remaining elements of governance to really complete the job.
Yes, sir.
Karim Qawar from Jordan. Mr. Prime
Can
Minister.
you speak up a little bit, Mr. Bass?
Karim Qawar from Jordan. Mr. Prime Minister, I salute your leadership.
I salute you, long time. How are you?
Thank you, sir. Despite common wisdom, the past administration pushed for the Palestinian elections, which brought Hamas to power, and which has been a major setback for moderates, as well as the international community. We have seen recent trends in the region with the elections in Lebanon and the elections in Iran. If the next Palestinian elections and when they are held, what is your outlook on those elections, and how will that be taken in moving the peace process forward?
Let me first say that they should be held, number one, because there is a question now in some people's mind as to whether or not they will be held
in January,
when they were supposed to be held, which is January of next year. I said it before and I repeat it today. I do not believe when it comes time to constitutionally mandated time for elections, that should be subject matter of debate between factions. It's a right of the citizens, and those elections should be held in January of 2010, no matter what the outcome is. Although I believe, given the evolution over the past couple of years, there has definitely been willingness on the part of people, our people, to entertain the thought and possibility that a different approach to getting us to where we all want to go, which is to ending the occupation and to live as free people, that the approach that we have adopted actually made sense to them. There are signs of that, and I should say not only in the West Bank, but also in Gaza, where we are not able to operate freely, as you know, but we certainly have not stopped operation completely. Elections are elections. It's hard for me to say what the mood of people will be in January of next year. Nevertheless, I think trying to get away from elections is definitely not a good way of projecting the sort of confidence in people's better judgment. It would not really be right. So first of all, we should really insist that they be held. Two, we should continue to do the very best we can, building in a meaningful way, in a convincing way towards statehood in the way that we have been doing. All the while trying to also bring along with us the necessity of having meaningful movement on the political track. So there is a political horizon, beginning with the implementation of those important requirements of success, roadmap obligations, for people to begin to see that actually the whole effort is beginning to make sense, that we're really going from A to B. If we do all of these things, I think the outcome of elections in 2010 stands a good chance of being different from what obtained in 2010 would be different from what obtained in 2006. I think that's likely.
But to return to a point that the Secretary raised earlier, why should a party be allowed to stand for elections if it's still taking up arms? Shouldn't that be a prerequisite for entering into the democratic process?
I think that's a valid point. Elections, and first of all, we're not a state. Let's all remember that. And sometimes, we run ahead of ourselves and think and act as if we are one, and not only that, but sometimes even a superpower in some areas. We should respect the fact, as I do fully, that we are at this stage a product of a certain political process that brought with it some constraints and some commitments. And that is the framework within which we are operating. Political process, the PA itself was created as a product of a political process that came with certain commitments and obligations. How can we, as a point of logic, act in a manner consistent with that when it comes to an element of governance, an important one like elections? For sure. The difficulty with that was very much in evidence after the elections. That oddity became something that everybody saw and had a very hard time to deal with. We cannot really deal with the past. The past is the past. What happened, happened. But I think there are lessons that we should learn from that experience going forward. We Palestinians, like other peoples around the world, will always have different views as to what is important, what's less important, what's not important. That by itself is not unusual, and I would regard that as an expression, manifestation, or reflection of political pluralism, something which countries aspire to get, and they would regard as an indication of political maturity. It's not that is a problem. It's how we go about managing it that's a problem. It's one thing for us to have different views. If that's understandable in a mature democracy, how come it is something that is frowned upon, the mere difference of view, in a place like Palestine, where we have this long history of discord, we have these challenges, these frustrations, these disappointments, and the rest of it. What we really, I believe, have learned from that experience, and I think this is the lesson of all of this, is what is it that we really can and should do in order to manage those differences, to manage that political pluralism in a sensible way. And that's something we definitely did not demonstrate over the past years, and I hope that that experience will have been learned for the future, for the purpose of the next elections.
Senator, do you want to weigh in there, or should we go to
Well,
another question?
I wanted to just make one comment. Hamas is a big problem. And I don't pretend to know how the Palestinian Authority should deal with it. But I can tell you the reflection in the rest of the world is that here still is a militaristic / terrorist organization that still believes Israel should be driven into the sea, does not admit Israel's right to exist, and really, when faced with the opportunity to make the change, has refused to do so. So that's a big problem out there, and it really has to be faced. I don't understand it, because the people that Hamas serves have so much more to be gained from peace, from cooperation, from economic upward mobility, from being able to take care of their children and live in an upwardly mobile world, that you perpetuate this terrorist mentality. You never get to what life has to offer, really. And I don't know how you change that. I hoped Egypt could in this discussion, but for the rest of us that look at Hamas, you wait to see some change, that the maturity you spoke about has happened. And to the best of my knowledge, it has not as of yet.
Yes. Can I comment on that? You asked, Senator, how it is that we actually see that, back home, and how is it that we really see us dealing with this challenge where you have a group or more than one group that just simply would not subscribe to the path that we have committed ourselves to which we remain committed, path of nonviolence leading to durable and lasting peace, prosperity, and harmony in the region. They don't. They haven't, as you're right, given the opportunity, they have not showed any willingness to change their platform. That's the fact of life. They are there, and they represent an ideology, which itself is a part, the way I assess things, a broader ideology that engulfs much of the region that I call actually rejectionism, rejecting status quo. That's a challenge. You asked how you deal with that. You're dealing basically here with groups, with parties that come to this from different ends of the spectrum, way too far left, from way far left to way far right, all agreeing on the fashionability of going against traffic, basically. And you ask how you deal with a situation like this, and I personally have long come to the conclusion that you really cannot deal with them on split-screen television debate, because, the overall overriding sentiment out there is one of rejectionism. The way you deal with it is by trying something else, which is to get people to, over time, compare that which is done to effect a meaningful change for the better in people's life with that which is being said about it. I think we stand much better chance of winning that debate than going about it in a war of words, which is what has typified much of the argument over this divide in the Middle East for a long time.
This is what makes it very hard for Israel.
Yeah.
Israel, we spoke earlier about Israel helping enable the economic opportunity, reducing the checkpoints. I understand the argument on the permits. If you can't get a permit to do this or that, how do you run a business? Or if it's unpredictable, how do you run a business? All of that is true. But at the same time, if you have this organization out there that is committed to destruction, it makes it very hard for Israel then to enable the kind of progress you so badly need and want and deserve.
Yeah. But in parallel with that, and that's what the Israelis see. They're dealing with an authority which repeatedly has said and maintained and continues to, and I repeat it today. While I can understand people coming at things from different point of view and having different views, calling that political pluralism, security pluralism is something we cannot and will never accept. And Israel sees that. And as a matter of fact, therefore, we decided to act in a manner fully consistent with that. And that explains, to a large measure, the progress that we've been able to achieve in the West Bank over the past couple of years. We are definitely firmly committed to the path of nonviolence, to all of the commitments that we entered into, and to really uphold that and do the very best we can to continue to uphold it. But we really think this is the best way of going about it. Hamas, and others, can think whatever they think. If they are not allowed to act on that by having their militias and doing things like that, then I think that really would make a big difference. And that, I believe, is what has happened. And that, I believe, is what the whole region is beginning to see, including Israel.
Let's just say a word on this.
We're over time, I know. I can't bear to interrupt this conversation, though, so please, if you have to leave.
I'm the one that put Hamas on the terrorist list when we did the organizational thing. But I think that what is very important is to recognize the fluidity of the situation. In listening to what the Prime Minister says, the elections are in January, long time. Frankly, in this part of the world. And given the kinds of discussions that Senator Mitchell is carrying on and his experience in dealing with the Northern Ireland issue and dividing the IRA from Sinn Féin, I think we need to look at what the future can bring and to also do, in many ways, follow the lead of what the Palestinian Authority. They have as much trouble with Hamas as the Israelis do in many ways. And so I think that we need to look at this. I'm chairman of the board of the National Democratic Institute that works on election processes. And I just was in Lebanon. I think there are ways, frankly, Mr. Prime Minister, we can be helpful to you in some of the process aspect of establishing a constitutional committee that would look at if there are violations in a variety of ways. Hezbollah participated in those. They lost. I mean, it's very interesting, and I do think that a lot of changes are in the works between now and January. And the question is how to establish the processes that might change the way that Hamas is behaving. And
I think you hit the nail on the head, if I might say. And this is hard, but, if the Palestinian Authority represents the people on the West Bank, and the people on the West Bank want to have a country, a state, and recognize Israel and live in peace, and that excludes Gaza, that still ought to be possible, in my view. Because I don't know if you can change the Hamas mindset in a generation. You can't wait for a generation for this to happen. Now is the time. I mean, look at all the agreements. I read Dennis Ross's book, which chapter and verse goes through every iteration of the settlement, from water to this to that to the other thing. So everybody knows what the answers are. The question is the political will there to do it? And are we going to let Hamas stop it? Do you differ with that?
No. And I think that's really the challenge. I think this vision can be realized. I personally cannot conceive of Palestinian statehood only on the West Bank. That has to really mean both West Bank and Gaza. People in Gaza are not Hamas. Gaza is under Hamas's control now. Overall sentiment in Gaza is not different from what it is on the part of the people, from what it is in the West Bank. I think pushing the idea of elections is an important thing, because it doesn't look to me like they're eager to have elections. And that's an important element to capture.
We were there before, too. Nobody expected
Right.
Hamas to win.
We don't know what the outcome is going to be.
The jobs.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
Anyway.
I think we have to wrap it up. My apologies to people who waited patiently at the mic. My thanks to the panel for a very unusual conversation. Thank you. Couldn't.